Hello, welcome back to Language Development. Today we're going to talk about Baker chapter 16 and chapter 17. Let's start with chapter 16, Deaf People, Bilingualism, and Bilingual Education. In the beginning, Baker introduces the deaf community and tells us background information about the deaf population. So 1 out of 1,000 people are born each year with varying degrees of deafness. 19 out of 20 are born to hearing parents. And so their parents do not have varying levels of deafness. They have full hearing abilities. Unfortunately, deaf people have been discriminated against like many language minority groups in the past, and they have historically held reduced power and status. And so, like many of the language minority groups we've discussed this year, deaf people are likewise, unfortunately, a marginalized community. Deaf, in this chapter and in general, we will use deaf with a capital D. So we will spell it with a capital D. And that's to indicate that many deaf people prefer the capital D because they view themselves as a cultural group and a linguistic group. And so just like you capitalize different cultural groups like African American with capital A, Mexican American with capital M, American with a capital A, also different languages, Spanish with a capital S, English with a capital E. Same thing with people from the deaf community. So deaf would be a proper noun describing a particular group. So deaf people can become bilinguals in various ways. So the first way could be learning to first sign so they would learn sign language as their first language, and then they might learn literacy in another language, normally the majority language. A second way that deaf people could become bilingual is that deaf people could learn to speak from hearing parents and then later learn sign language. A third way that deaf people could become bilingual is that they could learn sign language first, but then also learn some kind of oral form of the hearing language through school or through their families. So deaf people often have their own language community. Unfortunately, like we've talked about, deaf people have been a marginalized community, and so many times they have been required to, or they have felt obligated to assimilate into the hearing community. Deaf people can have various ways of identifying themselves and associating themselves with particular groups. So some deaf people associate primarily with the deaf community and consider themselves deaf people. Others associate more with hearing people or the hearing community. And then finally, there could be people who associate with both groups, who feel part of the deaf community but also part of the hearing community. The recognition of sign language as an official minority language and the concept of deaf wellness, so supporting the well-being of the deaf community, are ways that deaf people in the deaf people community work to empower themselves and to regain control of their own narrative. So they have more auto-determination, more self-determination, and more agency when they have their language, sign language, recognized as an official minority language, and when their community's interests are being considered. Similar to other types of bilinguals, deaf people often use two languages for various functions and purposes. So they'll have various language targets, people they communicate with, and also various language contexts, situations in which they use language, and they will change that based either using sign language or the majority language or whatever language, other oral language they speak. They will change how their language targets are represented or how their what language context they're using their language based on often the needs of the person they're communicating with. So an example would be often deaf people use sign language when they're communicating with others of the deaf community, But sometimes deaf people will often use the spoken language or literacy, so reading and writing, to communicate in the majority language to other people in the hearing community. Like many parts of education, there's a deficit model and an enrichment model. So the deficit model we've talked about a lot, and we've also referred to as the subtractive model. And so in the deficit education model of deaf education, deaf students are not encouraged to become bilingual, but rather they are encouraged to, as much as possible, adopt the hearing language in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And so they're submerged in the hearing language in culture, and they're not encouraged to learn sign language. And so, unfortunately, often, just like a subtractive bilingual model, this could lead to the loss of deaf people's first language, which is sign language. On the other hand, there's the enrichment model. And in the enrichment model, this encourages that deaf people learn, not only maintain their first language, sign language, but they also develop a strong proficiency in the majority language and the majority hearing language. So there's different viewpoints about deaf people. So the first viewpoint is that deafness is considered a disability that needs to be remedied. And this would once again be a subtractive mindset or a deficit mindset. So in this mindset, people view deafness as a disability or a defect. And deafness should be cured, so, air quotes there, or remedied by cochlear implants and hearing aids. Also, spoken language should be promoted over learning sign language. So when deaf people are young, and even before they start school, they should, according to this mindset, this deficit mindset, this deafness as a disability mindset, the hearing parents or parents in general should be speaking oral language to deaf students rather than teaching them sign language. This theory, this deficit theory, also focuses on the assimilation of deaf people within the hearing community. So even though deaf people might have reduced hearing abilities, they are expected to fully assimilate into the hearing community, regardless of whether they also want to have their own community where they use sign language. So once again, a separate deaf community under this disability mindset would be discouraged. So a separate deaf community or a separate deaf culture would be minimalized according to this mindset. On the other hand, there's the mindset which would be more towards additive bilingualism or enrichment thinking, and that deaf people are their own cultural and linguistic group. And so in this mindset, deafness is not considered a disability, but just a cultural difference between deaf people and hearing people. And so signing is viewed as the most effective and natural way for deaf people to communicate with each other and with others. Sign language is also considered a grammatically sophisticated language that's very complex and allows deaf people to express the same amount of depth and complexity as they would with any other spoken language. Furthermore, this belief would advocate that sign language adds language diversity to deaf people, and that deaf people are a linguistic and cultural minority with their own beliefs, identity, and cultural practices. Now let's talk about deaf education. So in deaf education, there's been increasing focus on the language development of sign language as the student's first language. So the belief is, and it's been backed up by research, is that the early use of signing helps deaf people with access to content. So so it's more effective for deaf people to get the full meaning, the full input of the content, or the full understanding of the content instruction, than getting a partial understanding through an oral administration of the content. And so deaf people would be encouraged to have access to the content through sign language because they're more likely to get a full understanding of the complete message than if they were just going to hear a spoken or oral form of the content presented in the hearing language. After students develop fluency in sign language, they will be encouraged to develop bilingualism through learning literacy and sometimes also oracy, like speaking and listening, in the majority language. There's also a movement in deaf education toward deaf people having a recognition of their own community and forming their own identity. Technology also plays an important role more and more, not only in hearing education, but also in deaf education. It facilitates communication. So many deaf people communicate through text, video phones, Skype, blogs, video logs, etc. And this is a great way to foster communication in sign language. There are 9 subpopulations of the deaf population, or deaf people, in the United States, according to Baker. The first subpopulation are people who use sign language, American Sign Language in the United States, as their primary language. So this is their language they feel most comfortable using, and also the language they use the most often. The second group would be people who communicate in both sign language and English, and so they feel comfortable and they often communicate in both languages. A third subpopulation would be people who can communicate primarily through speech. So their main way of communicating is through oral language, through speech, and through also communicating through literacy, reading and writing. And these groups of people are often hearing impaired, so they were able to develop a lot of the hearing language through partially being able to hear most of the content and the language orally. A fourth group would be adults who became deaf later in their lives. And these adults have well-embedded speech patterns from before they became deaf. And so they have a lot of ability to still communicate with the hearing community and using their oral language skills because they have that well-developed speech patterns that they had learned before they had become deaf. A fifth subpopulation are elderly people who became deaf due to age. So now let's talk about deaf people and signing. And so sign language is now a symbol of unity for people in the deaf community. There are more than 200 sign languages. Unfortunately, many do not have official status or recognition at the government level. Sign language is not gesturing. Gesturing is very simplistic and has a very low complexity. Rather, sign language is a highly complex, rule-bound language that has grammar embedded into the language, grammar rules and a grammatical system, so that people who speak sign language can communicate as in depth and in such complex messages as someone who is speaking a hearing language. Sweden was the first country to officially recognize sign language as a native language of the country. And so in Sweden, deaf people are encouraged to become bilingual. First, they're encouraged to become bilingual in Swedish Sign Language as their native language. And then also they're learning Swedish as a second language. So the education of deaf students has three approaches, or deaf education has three approaches. The first approach is the traditional approach. And this is the theory that deaf students should have their residual hearing improved by using hearing aids. And the idea is that deaf students will learn the hearing language as much as possible. And so they're also encouraged to develop speech reading skills or lip reading skills, and they're further asked to improve their speech production skills in the hearing language. A second approach is the total communication approach, and this is in which deaf people use simultaneous communication, such as auditory input and visual communication. So this would be where deaf people are hearing the speaking majority language, and then they're also signing as well at the same time. And so they're receiving both auditory language in terms of the majority language, but they're also receiving visual input in the sign language. Unfortunately, this is also an assimilationist approach. The goal is for deaf people to be part of the majority language community instead of being part of their own community. And also, the emphasis is on the hearing language more than sign language. The third type of education for deaf students is also now becoming one of the most popular ones, and it is sign bilingual education. Sign bilingual education can occur in special schools or classes, or it could also be included in mainstream hearing classes with someone who is providing deaf education support inside the mainstream hearing classroom. There are several principles of sign language bilingual education, or sign bilingual education. The first principle is that sign language should be the first language of all deaf children. This should be their primary language. They have the best abilities for sign language, and so that should be promoted. The second principle is that sign language should be used to teach curriculum content. So it should be used to teach science, math, reading, social studies, fine arts, any kind of curriculum content. Third, sign language should be the medium in which deaf people learn English as a second language. And so deaf people learn sign language as their first language, and then they learn English through their first language. And so they are able to transfer skills from sign language, their literacy skills, their grammar skills, their thinking skills in sign language, into learning their second language, English, or the majority language. A fourth principle of sign bilingual education is that the culture and language of the deaf community should be supported and validated. And so that their traditions, their beliefs, and their practices should be encouraged, and that people who are deaf should be encouraged to form part of that community and incorporate into that community. A fifth principle of sign bilingual education is that bilingualism provides many cognitive and academic benefits for all bilinguals, but also including deaf bilinguals. So research shows that students who have a stronger American Sign Language proficiency or first language proficiency can transfer those skills and acquire the English literacy skills much more effectively than a student who is deaf and does not have a strong background in American Sign Language. So deaf people are best served and more effectively served by learning American Sign Language as their first language, because they can much quickly transfer into learning the majority language, English. A sixth principle is that curriculum should not be transmitted in the spoken language. That would be, so the spoken hearing language. That would be equivalent to submersion of ELL students. And so the idea is that you cannot really expect deaf students to acquire content at the same speed as hearing students if you're only presenting that content in the spoken language. Deaf people have a reduced ability to hear that spoken language, and so they would have a reduced opportunity to access that content. And so they would have a limited ability to access that content, and they could fall academically behind. So instead of trying to put them on an unfair playing field where they're expected to learn through the hearing language, deaf people should be taught through sign language, which would be an equal playing field because they could be taught at the same pace and at the same proficiency level as in American Sign Language as their age level peers who are learning in the hearing language. A seventh principle of sign bilingual education is that the majority language should be developed through sign language. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but sign language is once again the first language, and students transfer their skills into the majority language. The eighth principle is that students should learn sign language as soon as possible after birth. Just like how hearing children learn language through their caregivers, through constant input of language from their caregivers, deaf people should also have constant language input through sign language. They should be exposed to sign language as early as possible, and should be taught in sign language as early as possible, so that the deaf people can develop their proficiency in sign language and have as much language proficiency and vocabulary as those in the hearing community. A ninth principle is that in order to avoid language delay, it is very important that students learn sign language as soon as possible. Language delay has been shown through research to occur through the auditory approach, where deaf people are encouraged to only learn through the hearing approach. And also, language delay has also been shown to occur when deaf people are taught through the total communication approach. So basically, the principle is educational research should be used to help determine which is the most effective type of deaf education. And according to educational research, the best form of deaf education that does not allow for language delays, that reduces language delays and reduces curriculum delays, is to teach students in sign language first as their native language. A 10th principle for the education of deaf students is that it's important and possible to increase the supply of trained deaf bilingual educators. So you could have people who are both from the deaf population and also the hearing population, and you can, as teachers in the deaf educational system, and these teachers, through government funding, through increased levels of certification, increased certification practices, and service-oriented and pre-service training, these people could be effective teachers in deaf education. So there should be more emphasis placed on deaf education as its own certification route and pre-service educational program. An 11th principle of sign bilingual education is that the parents of deaf children should be given substantial social and emotional support, as well as academic guidance to support their children's bilingualism. And so parents of deaf children should be taught sign language so that they can provide regular input in sign language to their children, and so that their children will have a strong development of their first language, sign language, and they'll have a strong vocabulary in their first language, sign language, so that they'll transition into the formal schooling system when they enter school at a much better pace. Furthermore, since many parents of deaf children come from the hearing community, they might be unaware of the unique traditions, the unique characteristics of the deaf community, and so they should also be provided social and emotional support so that they understand how they can best support their children's growth as a deaf person. Just like any type of educational practice, it's best to have a parent, school, and community partnership. And so parents, schools, and communities should all have an interconnected relationship where they work together for the mutual growth of students. And so parents of deaf children should have an active involvement in schools. Schools should actively recruit parents of deaf children and help and have resources and programs for those people. And the deaf community should have a role in the educational system of deaf children. A 12th principle of deaf education, sign bilingual education, is team teaching. And so this principle would have it where a deaf teacher who is part of the deaf community teaches deaf children sign language as a first language. And then a hearing teacher works to help develop deaf students' acquisition of the majority language. Both teachers would know sign language and would also know the majority language, and both teachers would have a firm grasp of deaf culture and education so that they could support their students in their acquisition of both languages. Now let's talk about Chapter 17, Bilingualism and Bilingual Education, Problem, Right, and Resource. Baker provides three perspectives or opinions on language and its presence in society. Once again, these are opinions, and they're not all based on research, and Baker just tries to consider all different viewpoints that people, especially in the United States, have toward language. The first perspective views language as a problem. It's a deficit perspective. And so this theory is that bilingualism causes social discord or political conflict. People have different identities, and because they have different identities and different languages, that takes away from a national identity and a national culture. These people also claim that there's an inner conflict within a bilingual person. And so bilingual people can become confused or have like these split bilingual identities. Moreover, these people who hold this perspective that language is a problem also feel that language groups and immigrants should assimilate into the English-only culture as soon as possible. So counter-arguments to this policy would be that actually there's better educational outcomes when students are taught in their native language. And so if you're really wanting inclusion and people incorporated into the economy, into society, it's very important that they receive an effective education. And so since they receive an effective education with learning first their native language, then ideally you should still have bilingual education. A second counter-argument to this theory that language is a problem is that actually people have, when they have a much more secure identity, then they feel much more respected. And so if they feel much more secure and respected, there's less likely going to be a chance of violent revolt or violence between different groups. It's normally when different cultural identities are repressed or different beliefs are suppressed, that is when large-scale division, large-scale violence occurs between different cultural and ethnic groups. Also, a third theory, I didn't put it here, but if you go back to the idea of the inner conflict, the split identity theory, if you think about some of the other chapters we've learned in this course, bilingualism has not been shown to impact negatively cognitive function. Rather, bilingualism has shown to increase cognitive function. And in fact, when bilinguals use their brain, they often use the same part of their brain when they are speaking either language. And so they have that common underlying proficiency of their brain that they're using to speak their languages. And so it really doesn't cause this disruption inside a person's brain to be bilingual. In fact, as we've talked about, there's many brain benefits of bilingualism. So the second perspective is that language is a right. So people who hold this perspective feel that language is a basic human right. The individual choice to speak a language is similar to someone's choice to believe a certain religion or to practice their culture or to practice their belief system. People who hold this perspective also argue that there's a need to end discrimination in a democratic society. That's the goal of democracy, is for all people to have equal participation, and that effectively allows for a democratic government when all people have a voice and all people have choice. And so discriminating against someone based on language would hinder the progress of a democracy. Furthermore, language discrimination has had many negative consequences, especially during colonialism. And so many times people have talked about how the suppression of their language ended up being like a suppression of their whole personal being and identity. And because they were restricted from using their language, they lost self-determination and they lost their part of themselves. Furthermore, there's international law backing for the concept of language as a right. So in the UN Declaration, indigenous people have a right to self-determination. Indigenous people across the world are free to pursue cultural development, and the United States has signed on to this agreement, and most of the countries in the world have signed this agreement, asserting that indigenous people have a right to speak their own language. Moreover, indigenous people also have a right to control their education and their language choices. So indigenous people have a right to determine if they want to have instruction in their native language in education and the education they receive. Furthermore, the concept or the perspective that language is a right is also well established in U.S. law. So in the United States, there's no official language. In fact, many of the different 13 colonies, the original 13 colonies, spoke different languages. For example, New York was New Amsterdam, and they spoke Dutch. Many parts of Pennsylvania, for example, spoke a form of German. And then also there were other languages spoken across the colonies. And so there wasn't an official language even in the beginning of the United States. We have a de facto language based on the fact that the majority of people spoke English in the United States during the 13 colonies, and that has been our de facto language, our most common language in the United States, but it's not officially in the Constitution or in or any official document, really, except maybe at the state level for some states. And we talked about that in terms of the English-only movement in California, which I didn't mention in the last lecture, but actually the English-only movement in California was a referendum passed by voters in 1998 that only allowed for English to be the official language in schools. But now, actually, later, about 20 years, or less than 20 years, but 15 years later, in the last couple years, that policy has been overturned. So now English only is not the official policy of California anymore. I hadn't mentioned that before. Another way that language rights are ingrained in U.S. legal policy and U.S. law is the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment says that there's an equal protection for all people under the Constitution. You cannot discriminate based on race, ethnicity, culture, and that also implies language, because language is a part of all of those things. And the Supreme Court has used the 14th Amendment to uphold language rights. So in Meyer versus Nebraska, in I believe it was 1920s, and we've talked about this in earlier chapters, in Meyer versus Nebraska, it supported the right of German communities to teach their native language after school. And then furthermore, in Law versus Nichols in the 1960s, in the Chinese American community in San Francisco, Law versus Nichols established that English language learners have a right to an equal education and a right to equal educational opportunities. And teaching in only through submersion, all English instruction is proven to be ineffective, and so that takes away from those children's educational opportunities. Therefore, one of the remedies, according to the Law versus Nichols remedies that the Office of Civil Rights established in the government, was that schools could be teaching bilingual education and the use of students' native language as a means of instruction to provide effective educational opportunities for all students. A third perspective is language as a resource. And so people who hold this perspective feel that languages support participation in public and private relationships. So because you have translations and you have translators and you have different languages, access to different languages, people can have more effective participation in the political process. They can vote. They can build better relationships with community members. They can take an active role in the educational system. Furthermore, people who view language as a resource argue that language as a resource could also help build bridges across groups that have historically been fighting over religious conflicts or political conflicts. And so if they use language as a means to effectively communicate between each other, it might lead to further peace. A third part of language as a resource is that in the United States, especially, we focus on foreign language education because the main goal is that we push language onto our, especially high school students, so that they can be competitive globally and also in terms of for national security purposes. However, the only interesting part about this is that there's somewhat of a paradox, and that in the U.S. we've often encouraged immigrant groups to assimilate and to lose their native language by the third generation, but at the same time, we've now encouraged our students to also learn a second language, especially during high school. And so it's very important that if we view language as a resource, then you must also consider that bilingual students should be able to keep their native language so they can gain the benefits of being globally competitive and also the national security benefits of knowing various languages. Moreover, another aspect of the third perspective, language as a resource, is that people who hold this belief, just like people who hold the perspective of language as a right, view language as a supporter of national unity, and that language diversity can coexist with national unity. So people can still love their country, but also keep their culture and language. And so, furthermore, people who feel that they are tolerated, they are respected, and that they can maintain their own individual identity are more likely to not only participate, but also support the government and support the national identity of the country they live in. They'll be less likely to feel repressed and less likely to feel the need to rebel or to act out violently. The only problem with the language as a resource perspective is that sometimes it can lead to stratification or prioritization of more prestigious languages over others in the educational system. An example would be England. And so in England, even though there's a large population of the population, maybe like 5%, that are native speakers of South Asian languages such as Hindi, in England, most students are encouraged to learn a second language that is French, because French that people view is more competitive as a global language and maybe more relevant in the European Union community or in the European community. And so people in England are, their students are, instead of being taught their native language, Hindi, which more students speak than students who speak French at home, they are instead taught French as their second language, and thus their first language, Hindi, or other South Asian languages, is being discouraged in favor of students learning English and then a third language, French. And so arguably those students could theoretically lose their first language, Hindi, or another South Asian language, and instead it would be replaced with English and maybe some proficiency in French due to foreign language classes in French. Let's talk about the different language orientations or perspectives in the United States. So in the United States, we have basically two perspectives. We have the melting pot perspective, and we have the salad bowl perspective, or the multiculturalism perspective. And I'm going to talk about both of them. So the melting pot perspective, or other people might call it the assimilation perspective, is that different cultural groups, different linguistic groups should assimilate, and that through assimilating into a national culture, they can maybe influence the national culture slightly, maybe introduce different types of foods into the national culture, or different types of words in the national language. And the idea, though, is that all people will end up having one national culture, one national language, and a shared social, political, and economic ideal that is based on the national language and the national identity. People who critique this would argue that the melting pot perspective often prioritizes Anglo-Saxon culture over other cultures. And the reason why it prioritizes Anglo-Saxon European culture is because that group had historical power over other both European cultural groups and also over marginalized populations such as African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans. And so especially the assimilation perspective, or the melting pot perspective, became popular in the early 1900s. And during this time, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans were still heavily disenfranchised. They were second-class citizens who attended segregated schools, who had reduced opportunities to vote and participate in politics, and also were subject to legal discrimination and segregation. And so that policy of the focus on assimilating into one national identity is often perceived as, by many critics of this melting pot perspective, as an identity that focuses on a white Western European identity. People who support the melting pot perspective, the assimilation perspective, support the English-only movement. They feel that English should be the national language, and that in schools, English should be the only language taught to students, unless you are teaching a foreign language, perhaps in high school or something. In that case, English would still be the main language, the majority language, the predominant language that students speak throughout their educational career. People who support the melting pot perspective would advocate for a weak or subtractive form of bilingual programs. So they would not be concerned if students lose their native language, because they would argue that students would benefit from learning the majority language and the American language according to them. And so these people would also advocate for either ESL immersion programs, where students are immediately placed in all English classes, or transitional bilingual programs, where students might learn in their native language initially but quickly transfer to all English classes. Once again, it's part of the English-only movement that was somewhat successful in creating English-only policies in 3 states, California, Arizona, and Massachusetts. But one thing to note, which I didn't note in my past lecture, was that I found out after doing a little bit more research that California has changed their English-only policy. So I had mentioned in the past lecture that they had done research and it had shown that the English-only policy was not an effective educational policy in California, and that people who were in English-only classes were actually more behind in their English than students who had learned both in Spanish and English and bilingual programs. So anyway, California also changed that policy, so it's now not only an English-only educational state in the sense that people can attend bilingual programs. They've also done research, and it shows that many times people who hold this assimilationist perspective often have less education and less economic opportunity. So they're often from lower economic classes, or they might be blue-collar working class. They also have had less exposure to diversity and diverse peoples and different languages and different cultures. And so people from those backgrounds, less education, less economic opportunities, and also who have had less exposure to diversity often hold an assimilationist perspective because they perceive that their economic and cultural interests are at threat, that they are being infringed upon by increased diversity and increased competition, especially economically. People on the other side would argue for the salad bowl perspective. So the salad bowl perspective, or multicultural perspective, argues that groups should maintain their own identity, their own culture. They should recognize and learn their history, and also retain and maintain their native language. So people should recognize and value and celebrate differences between groups, but also groups can still come together to form a diverse whole. Just like in a salad, when a salad has different parts, lettuce, tomatoes, maybe onions, salad dressing, cheese if you want cheese in it as well. So there's many different parts, but they come together to make one delicious entity or result. And so people who hold the salad bowl perspective would hold the English plus perspective, or be part of the English plus movement. So they would want students to, of course, become proficient in English, which is our majority language and essential for economic and educational success, but they would also want students to become fluent and maintain their native language. So groups would be encouraged to maintain their native language and educate their children in strong bilingual programs. So these would be dual language programs or language heritage programs or developmental bilingual programs in which students would develop a strong proficiency in their first language, which would help them to transfer their skills, their literacy skills, and their cognitive skills to their second language, English. People who support the salad bowl perspective often cite educational research, which shows that students in strong bilingual programs often learn English at a faster rate than students who would just only have all English. So students who are learning in their native language and in English learn more than a student who just learns only in English in submersion English policies. And the point, just the logic behind it, which has been supported with educational research, is that, once again, students can transfer skills from their native language. So if they have a strong proficiency in their native language, they have academic vocabulary, they have cognitive skills, they have metalinguistic awareness and grammatical skills and knowledge of print that they can transfer to learning their second language, English. Moreover, students who are being educated in their native language are also more likely to be successful academically, especially in the early stages of their education. And so if they've been academically successful and they have a history of academic success, they're much more likely to have buy-in to the educational system and support the educational system and strive to continue in the educational system so that they graduate and hopefully go on to higher education. Third, because bilingual programs allow parents better communication and better access to their child's education, parents have increased support for bilingual education and they have increased involvement in their children's education. If parents can talk to the teacher and find out what their students need and to get regular feedback from the teacher and tips from the teacher on how they can reinforce the lessons at home, students are much more likely to be academically successful. One criticism of the salad bowl perspective, however, is that some critics worry that bilingual education will cause separation and they'll cause groups of people to not integrate. People who disagree with that criticism would argue that students in strong bilingual programs are actually a lot more likely to graduate high school. And since high school graduation is often essential in terms of being economically included and to be integrated into the political realm and to the economy of the United States, people who support the salad bowl perspective would say that strong bilingual programs support more students being integrated into a mutual or collective American identity that's supported by our economic system and by our democratic system of government.